The explosion came without warning. The iron gate crashed inward, throwing sparks and twisted metal across the driveway. Before anyone understood what was happening, a black SUV tore through the opening and skidded to a stop in front of the mansion. 6-year-old Yuna stood on the front steps, her small hands wrapped tightly around a stuffed rabbit. A watering can lay on its side beside her, spilling water across the stone path. "Yuna!" the babysitter shouted. She ran without thinking. The little girl barely had time to look up before the young African woman reached her and pulled her behind one of the stone columns lining the entrance. A burst of gunfire shattered the flower pots they had been tending only moments earlier. White rose petals mixed with dust as pieces of broken clay scattered across the ground. The child buried her face against the woman's shoulder, trembling. "It's okay," she whispered, tightening her arms around her. "Stay with me. Don't let go." The little girl nodded, unable to speak. The front door flew open. A man stepped outside with calm, measured strides, as though chaos had no place in his world. His charcoal suit looked untouched despite the smoke drifting through the courtyard. He raised a pistol. 2 sharp shots echoed through the estate. The men climbing out of the SUV scrambled back inside. Tires screamed against the pavement as the vehicle disappeared through the broken gate. For several seconds, nobody moved. The babysitter looked at the man standing in the middle of the driveway. 3 months. She had worked in this house for 3 months. She thought she knew him. She thought he was a quiet businessman who spent too much time at work and too little time with his daughter. She had been wrong. Very wrong. 3 months earlier. Hello everyone! Before we get into today's story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your country and city in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy heartfelt romance with a little suspense, don't forget to subscribe. Now let's go back to the day everything began. Rain had been falling since early afternoon. By the time she stepped off the bus, the cuffs of her jeans were soaked, and the umbrella she carried had done very little to keep her dry. She stopped in front of an address that looked more like a luxury hotel than a family home. High stone walls surrounded the property, and the black iron gates were tall enough to hide almost everything beyond them. She checked the address on her phone, then she checked it again. "This has to be wrong," she murmured. It wasn't. She looked at the balance in her bank account one last time before slipping her phone back into her pocket. Enough money for a few packets of instant noodles. Not enough for next month's rent. Her cafe had reduced everyone's shifts again, and international students weren't allowed to work unlimited hours. She had already spent 2 weeks searching for another job. This interview felt like her last chance. She pressed the intercom. A camera above the gate tilted toward her. A few seconds later, the gates opened with a soft mechanical hum. As she walked inside, she couldn't help slowing down. The garden was spotless. Every hedge had been trimmed with almost obsessive precision, and a narrow stone path wound past flower beds that looked as though someone cared for them every single morning. Halfway to the front door, she felt someone watching her. She looked up. A little girl peeked from an upstairs window. The moment their eyes met, the child disappeared behind the curtain. The front door opened before she had the chance to knock. An elderly housekeeper greeted her with a polite smile. "Welcome. Please come in." The interview wasn't what she had expected. Instead of a panel of questions or a long discussion about qualifications, the housekeeper simply invited her into a bright sitting room and offered her a cup of tea. "We won't keep you long," she said kindly. "Master dislikes wasting people's time." A few minutes later, another woman entered carrying a folder. She explained the basics of the job. The position was live-in. Most of the work involved caring for one child, preparing simple meals when the cook wasn't available, helping with homework, and making sure the little girl never felt alone in the evenings. The salary made her blink. She read the number twice before looking up. "There isn't a mistake?" The woman smiled. "No." She tried to hide her surprise, but it wasn't easy. It was more money than she'd earned in several months working at the cafe. Before she could ask another question, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Footsteps echoed from the hallway. The staff immediately straightened their posture. A tall man entered without saying a word. He wasn't dressed to impress anyone. A dark suit, neatly buttoned, a silver watch, black leather gloves tucked beneath one arm. Nothing flashy. Yet something about him drew every eye in the room. He gave a short nod to the housekeeper, before his attention settled on the young woman. "You came from Nigeria?" His voice was calm, almost emotionless. "Yes. How long have you been in Korea?" "Almost 3 years. What are you studying?" "International business." He glanced briefly at the folder in his hand. "And why do you want this job?" She could have talked about tuition, unpaid bills, or the notices from her landlord sitting inside her apartment. Instead, she answered honestly, "I need the work." He held her gaze for another second, as though deciding whether there was more behind those words. "There usually is," he said. "There is," she admitted with a small smile. "But I don't think my problems should become yours." For the first time, something changed in his expression. Not a smile, just the slightest hint of curiosity. He closed the folder. "You can start tomorrow if you're still interested." She frowned. "That's all?" He looked almost puzzled by the question. "Were you expecting something else?" "I thought there would be another interview." "There isn't." With that, he excused himself and walked out of the room. She watched him disappear down the hallway before turning back to the housekeeper. "Does he always speak that little?" The older woman laughed under her breath. Today he spoke more than usual. She arrived the following morning with one suitcase and a backpack. Most of what she owned fit inside them. The housekeeper showed her to a modest room on the second floor, overlooking the garden. "You can unpack later," she said. "Someone has been waiting for you." She didn't understand what that meant until a tiny face peeked around the corner. The little girl stood half-hidden behind the wall, studying her with wide, curious eyes. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then the child pointed. "Your hair is different." The young woman reached up, touching one of her curls. "I've been told that before." The little girl stepped closer. "I've never seen hair like that." "You can look. I want to touch it." She laughed. "Only if you ask nicely." "May I?" "You may." Tiny fingers brushed against one curl before springing back in surprise. It bounced. The babysitter laughed so hard that the little girl started laughing too, even though nothing else had happened. The sound carried down the hallway. The housekeeper smiled quietly to herself. It had been a long time since laughter echoed through that house. Children decided very quickly whether they trusted someone. By the third day, the little girl had already made up her mind. She followed the babysitter everywhere, into the kitchen while breakfast was being prepared, out to the garden while flowers were watered, across the living room with coloring books tucked under one arm. When it was time for bed, she refused to sleep until one more story had been read. Every evening ended the same way. "Just one more." "You said that 20 minutes ago." "This one is the last one." "You promised that 3 stories ago." "I mean it this time." Neither of them believed it. Without anyone mentioning it, the house began to change. The silence that had settled over it for years slowly gave way to ordinary sounds. A child laughing over burnt pancakes. Music drifting from the kitchen while dinner was being made. Conversations floating through open windows on warm afternoons. Whenever he returned home from work, those sounds reached him before anyone opened the front door. He found himself pausing outside more than once, listening for a moment before going in. One evening, he arrived earlier than usual. Voices led him toward the kitchen. His daughter stood on a chair at the counter, completely covered in flour. The babysitter wasn't much better. Both of them were trying, and failing, to make dumplings. The kitchen looked as though it had survived a small snowstorm. His daughter looked up first. "Papa!" She jumped off the chair and ran straight into him. He caught her automatically. "Look what we made." She proudly held up a dumpling that leaned to one side like it had given up halfway through being folded. He studied it with complete seriousness. "I'm not entirely convinced this is a dumpling." The little girl gasped. "It has feelings." The babysitter pressed her lips together, trying not to laugh. "I think," she said carefully, She means it has character. He looked from the dumpling to the two flour-covered faces, staring back at him, the corner of his mouth lifted. Only for a second. It was enough. His daughter pointed at him with both hands. You smiled. I do smile. No, you don't. I have photographs that prove otherwise. You smile in pictures because people tell you to. The babysitter lowered her head, pretending to clean the counter before either of them noticed she was smiling too. I think, she said, your daughter may have a point. He looked at her. For a brief moment, she expected him to disagree. Instead, he quietly removed his suit jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and reached for an empty apron hanging beside the refrigerator. Show me, he said. How do you fold these properly? The little girl stared at him in disbelief. Then she clapped so loudly that the entire kitchen erupted in laughter once again. Dinner that evening took longer than anyone expected. Not because the dumplings were difficult to make. Most of them fell apart before they even reached the pot. The little girl insisted every broken one deserved a chance anyway, so they cooked them all. When they finally sat down, the housekeeper placed the bowls on the table and quietly excused herself. The little girl took one bite and frowned. I think mine exploded, the babysitter laughed. That's because you stuffed too much filling inside. I wanted it to be generous. Her father looked down at the dumpling that had completely opened in the broth. It certainly was. The little girl burst into another fit of laughter. For the rest of the meal, she did most of the talking. She spoke about a drawing she'd finished that afternoon, a pigeon she'd decided to name Mr. Kim, and how her math homework was unfair because numbers refused to stay where she put them. The adults mostly listened. Every now and then, the babysitter would answer one of her questions or gently remind her to chew before speaking. Her father watched the exchange without saying much. It was strange. For months, dinner had been little more than 10 quiet minutes before his daughter lost interest and asked to leave the table. Now she didn't seem to want the evening to end. When the meal was over, the little girl yawned so hard her eyes watered. The babysitter smiled. I think someone's bedtime arrived an hour ago. I'm not sleepy. She yawned again before finishing the sentence. Her father couldn't help smiling to himself. You've lost this argument. The child sighed dramatically. Fine. She reached for the babysitter's hand. Come with me. As they disappeared upstairs, he remained at the table for another minute. The kitchen was still messy. Flour dusted the countertop. Someone had left tiny handprints on one of the cabinets. Normally, he would have asked the staff to clean everything immediately. Instead, he left it exactly as it was. The house felt lived in. He had almost forgotten what that looked like. A week later, the babysitter noticed there was one part of the house the little girl always avoided. The second-floor hallway curved toward a single white door that remained closed from morning until night. Every time they walked past it, the child instinctively reached for her hand. One afternoon, curiosity finally got the better of her. What's inside that room? The little girl looked at the door but didn't answer. Before she could ask again, the housekeeper appeared carrying fresh towels. She followed the older woman's eyes. The room belonged to Madam. My employer's wife? The housekeeper nodded. Nothing has been moved since she passed. Does he ever go inside? Sometimes. And your daughter? The older woman shook her head. Not anymore. There was something in her voice that suggested the conversation should end there. So it did. Later that night, rain tapped softly against the windows. The little girl had already fallen asleep after insisting on 2 bedtime stories instead of 1. The babysitter closed the bedroom door as quietly as she could and headed downstairs. A light was still on in the study. She wasn't planning to interrupt. She only wanted a glass of water before going to bed. As she passed the doorway, she noticed him sitting alone. His jacket hung neatly over the chair behind him. A laptop sat open on the desk, but he wasn't looking at it. Instead, he held a framed photograph in both hands. She recognized the woman immediately. The same face appeared in every family picture throughout the house. His wife. He hadn't noticed her standing there. She quietly stepped back. You don't have to leave. His voice stopped her. She turned around slowly. I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to interrupt. You weren't. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he placed the photograph back on the desk. My daughter was difficult today? She smiled. Not at all. She usually gives people a hard time. I don't think she's difficult. No? I think she's lonely. His eyes settled on the photograph again. So do I. There wasn't much more to say after that. She gave a small nod. Good night. As she reached the door, he spoke again. Thank you. She looked back. For what? For making her laugh again. His voice was quiet, almost tired. She smiled warmly. She doesn't need much. No? Just someone who listens. He watched her leave without another word. The next morning began with sunshine. It also began with chaos. I don't want oatmeal. You said yesterday that oatmeal was your favorite. It was. What changed overnight? I changed. The babysitter folded her arms. So today's favorite is pancakes. You negotiated very well. I learned from cartoons. Her father walked into the dining room just in time to hear the last sentence. He looked at his daughter. I've clearly underestimated your business skills. The little girl grinned. I'll teach you. You'll have to start after breakfast. She pointed proudly at the babysitter. She already agreed. The babysitter blinked. I did? You were about to. For the first time in years, breakfast stretched well beyond 10 minutes. No one seemed to mind. As the days passed, he found himself coming home a little earlier whenever he could. At first, he blamed lighter meetings, then shorter traffic. Eventually, he stopped making excuses. There was simply something waiting for him at home that hadn't been there before. Not just his daughter, the warmth she had brought with her. Sometimes he would hear music playing softly from the kitchen. Other evenings he would find the two of them building blanket forts in the living room or arguing over board games with complete seriousness. The mansion no longer echoed. It breathed. And though he would never admit it aloud, he found himself looking forward to opening the front door. Winter settled over Seoul almost overnight. By the first week of December, the garden was dusted with snow each morning. The little girl had developed a habit of running to the window before breakfast, just to check whether it had snowed again. If it covers the bridge today, she announced one morning, school should be cancelled. The babysitter looked outside. The bridge is perfectly clear. The little girl sighed. I was hoping nature would help me. You'll have to survive another day. I've been surviving all week. The housekeeper chuckled as she set breakfast on the table. You sound just like your father. The child looked offended. I talk much more than Papa. No one would argue with that. That afternoon, they walked to a small park a few streets away. The bodyguards stayed far enough behind that they looked like ordinary people enjoying the weather. The babysitter had noticed them from her first week in the house, though no one had ever introduced them. They never interrupted, never joined conversations. They simply appeared whenever the child left the estate and disappeared once she was safely home again. As they fed pieces of bread to a flock of ducks, one of the men crouched beside the little girl. You've named this one yet? She nodded confidently. That's Professor. Professor? He walks like he knows everything. The guard laughed. I can't argue with that. The babysitter smiled to herself. It was the first time she'd seen one of the men relax. Until then, she'd assumed they didn't know how. On the walk home, curiosity finally got the better of her. She slowed her pace until she was walking beside the guard. Can I ask you something? If I can answer, why are there always security officers around her? He kept his eyes on the street ahead. Master is careful. Because he's wealthy? In this city, wealth attracts attention. It sounded rehearsed. She didn't press him, but the answer stayed with her. That evening, she found the little girl curled up on the sofa, with a photo album spread across her lap. The pages were filled with family pictures, birthday parties, beach holidays, cherry blossoms in spring. In every photograph, her mother smiled as though the camera had caught her in the middle of laughing. The child rested her chin on the album. I don't remember her voice anymore. The babysitter sat beside her without speaking. I remember her perfume, the little girl continued, and she always sang when she cooked. She traced one photograph with her finger. I don't want to forget. You won't. What if I do? The babysitter thought for a moment. My grandmother passed away when I was younger than you. The child looked up. I used to worry about forgetting her too. Did you? Some things, yes. The little girl's shoulders dropped. But then I realized something. What? We don't remember people by holding on to every detail. We remember them by the way they made us feel. The child stayed quiet. Your mother loved you very much. How do you know? Because every picture in this album says the same thing. The little girl looked down again. After a long moment, she leaned gently against the babysitter's shoulder. Neither of them spoke again. They didn't need to. Later that night, a car rolled through the front gate. It was nearly 11. She was locking the kitchen windows when she heard the engine. Through the glass, she saw him step out of the back seat. His tie was loose. His shoulders looked heavier than usual. He thanked the driver before walking toward the house alone. When he opened the front door, he seemed surprised to find someone still awake. I thought everyone was asleep. I couldn't. He noticed the mug in her hands. Tea? She nodded. You look exhausted. He gave a tired smile. So I've been told. There was a brief silence before she held up the mug. I made too much. He hesitated. Then, to her surprise, he accepted. They sat on opposite ends of the kitchen table. Outside, snow drifted quietly through the garden. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable, just peaceful. Finally, he looked around the kitchen. I haven't sat in here this late since my wife was alive. She glanced at him. You miss her. Every day. There was no hesitation in his answer. I don't think grief disappears. She nodded slowly. I don't think it's supposed to. He looked into his cup. People keep telling me time heals everything. My mother used to say time doesn't heal. He looked up. It teaches. He considered those words for a long moment. She sounds wise. She also made terrible jokes. That caught him off guard. What kind? She smiled. The kind that made everyone groan before they laughed. For the first time that evening, he laughed. It wasn't loud. It barely lasted a second. But it was real. At the top of the staircase, a tiny face peeked through the railing. The little girl watched quietly before smiling to herself. The next morning, she found the babysitter helping her pack her school bag. Papa laughed. The babysitter blinked. He did. I heard him. She zipped up the school bag. You were supposed to be asleep. I was. The little girl looked unusually serious. He never laughs with anyone. She paused. But he laughs with you. The babysitter felt her cheeks warm. I think he was just being polite. The child shook her head. No. She smiled in the simple, honest way only children could. You make the house warm. The babysitter didn't know what to say. So she simply brushed a strand of hair away from the little girl's face and smiled. Outside, one of the security guards watched them through the window. He smiled too. None of them noticed the dark sedan parked across the street. It had been there for almost 20 minutes. Its windows were tinted. The engine never turned off. Inside, someone lifted a camera. The shutter clicked once. Then again. The lens wasn't pointed at the mansion. It was focused on the little girl and the woman standing beside her. The dark sedan pulled away a few minutes before the school bus arrived. None of the guards reacted. By the time one of them glanced down the street, the car had already disappeared into the morning traffic. Inside, the little girl was searching everywhere for her missing mitten. I only have one. You had two when we came downstairs, the babysitter said. I know. So where did the other one go? The child thought about it with complete seriousness. I think it escaped. The babysitter laughed. Let's check your coat pocket before we report it to the police. The mitten was exactly where it was supposed to be. I knew it would come back, the little girl said proudly. After dropping her at school, the babysitter stopped at a neighborhood market on the way home. The chef had given her a short shopping list, insisting the vegetables tasted better when she picked them herself. She had just paid for everything when she noticed an elderly woman struggling with 2 heavy bags. Without thinking, she walked over. "May I help you?" The woman looked surprised. "You don't mind?" "Not at all." They walked together for several blocks. The older woman chatted happily the entire way, asking where she came from, how long she'd lived in Korea, and whether she'd grown used to the winters. Before they parted ways, the woman squeezed her hand. "Your mother raised you well." The words stayed with her long after she walked away. She returned to the mansion just before noon. As soon as she stepped inside, the housekeeper met her in the hallway. "Master is home." "At this hour?" He canceled his meetings. That was unusual. She found him in the library, standing by the window with a phone pressed to his ear. He ended the call as she entered. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You aren't." She placed the grocery bags on the table. "I didn't expect you home." "Neither did I." Something about him felt different. Not cold. Distracted. He looked as though his thoughts were somewhere else. She noticed a file lying open on the desk. Several photographs were spread across it. He closed the folder almost immediately. "I'm sorry," she said. "I wasn't looking." "I know." He picked up the folder and locked it inside a drawer. "Would you like some coffee?" She blinked. "You make coffee?" "I can follow instructions." She smiled. "I'm willing to take that risk." The kitchen filled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee. He measured everything carefully, reading the instructions twice before touching anything. She watched quietly, until he slid a cup toward her. She took one sip. "It's..." He raised an eyebrow. "Be honest." She laughed. "It's terrible." He looked down at his own cup, took a sip, and frowned. "It is. I didn't want to say it first. I appreciate your restraint." They both laughed. And the housekeeper stopped outside the kitchen for a moment. She couldn't remember the last time she'd heard him laughing with someone. She quietly walked away before they noticed her. That afternoon, the little girl came home carrying a drawing. She ran straight into the kitchen. "I made this." The paper showed 3 people holding hands beneath a bright blue sky. The babysitter recognized herself immediately. The little girl pointed at the tallest figure. "That's Papa." Then she pointed at herself. "And that's me." Finally, she tapped the woman with the curly hair. "And that's you." The babysitter smiled. "It's beautiful." Her father had just walked in. The child hurried over and held up the picture. "Do you like it?" He studied it carefully. "I do. You can hang it in your office." There was a pause. "My office? So you don't forget us." His eyes lingered on the drawing for a moment longer. "I think," he said quietly, "I'll keep it somewhere even better." That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, he placed the drawing inside the top drawer of his desk. It rested beside the only photograph he still carried of his wife. Across the city, a black sedan rolled into the underground parking garage beneath an unfinished office building. A man stepped out of the driver's seat carrying an envelope. Several others were already waiting. One of them opened the envelope and spread a collection of photographs across the hood of a car. The little girl leaving school. The babysitter holding her hand. The mansion. The security team. The man studying the photographs spoke without looking up. "So that's the new one." The child trusts her. "And the father? He comes home earlier now." Another man leaned against the car. "That wasn't happening 6 months ago." "No." The first man slid one photograph aside. It showed the babysitter laughing while the little girl clung to her arm. A slow smile crossed his face. "Everyone has a weakness." He tapped the photograph once. "We've just found his." The garage fell silent. One of the younger men hesitated. "You really think he'd risk everything for a babysitter?" The older man looked at him. "You've never met a man who buried his heart with his wife." The younger man shook his head. "No." "Then learn this." He gathered the photographs into a neat pile. "When a man like that starts smiling again, you pay attention." Back at the mansion, snow began falling once more. The babysitter stood on the balcony outside her room, watching flakes drift through the night. She had no idea that someone had been following her for days. She didn't know her photograph had been passed around a table filled with dangerous men. She thought the biggest challenge in her life was paying tuition and learning enough Korean to pass her next exam. Down in the garden, one of the senior bodyguards completed his nightly patrol before looking up at the lights in the house. He smiled faintly when he saw the child's bedroom still glowing. The mansion finally felt like a family home again. He hoped it would stay that way. It wouldn't. Far beyond the gates, headlights appeared at the end of the road. The car slowed, then stopped. Someone inside lifted a pair of binoculars toward the house. The waiting had begun.